Hello and welcome to Artificial Fluency. Today we're tackling a topic that many of our listeners have requested: how to become truly successful in English.
That's right. Learning a language is one thing, but achieving real success, where you can confidently use English in your personal and professional life, requires a strategic approach. Today, we'll share practical strategies that have helped countless language learners reach their English goals.
And we'll cover the entire journey from beginners just starting out to advanced learners looking to fine-tune their skills. Let's dive right in with the first and perhaps most important question. What does success in English actually look like?
That's a great starting point. Success in English means different things to different people. For some, it's being able to watch movies without subtitles or read books in English. For others, it's confidently giving presentations at work or negotiating business deals.
Exactly. And I think that's our first key insight. You need to define what success means for you personally. Without a clear definition, it's hard to create an effective learning plan or measure your progress.
Absolutely. I recommend that listeners take a moment to reflect on why they're learning English. Is it for career advancement? To study abroad? To connect with family members or friends? Your specific goals will shape your learning journey.
Once you've defined what success looks like for you, the next step is to assess where you are now. What's your current level, and what are the gaps between your current abilities and your goals?
There are several ways to do this self-assessment. Many online tests follow the common European framework of reference for languages, which ranges from A1, beginner, to C2, mastery. But you can also do a more practical assessment.
Right. Ask yourself specific questions like, can I understand news broadcasts? Can I participate in meetings? Can I write emails without checking every sentence? These practical benchmarks often give you a clearer picture than a formal test score.
Now let's talk about the path to success. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is focusing too narrowly on just one aspect of language learning, like only studying grammar or only watching English videos.
I completely agree. Successful English learners balance 4 key areas: input, listening and reading; output, speaking and writing; vocabulary and grammar; and strategic practice like test preparation or job interview skills.
Let's break down each of these areas, starting with input. What are your recommendations for effective listening and reading practice?
For listening, I suggest a 3-tier approach. Start with materials designed for learners, then move to slower, authentic content like news broadcasts or podcasts for English learners, and finally progress to natural speed, native content like our podcast.
And for reading, a similar progression works well. Graded readers or simplified news articles, then general interest magazines or blogs, and eventually authentic materials like novels or professional publications.
The key with both listening and reading is regular exposure. Even 15 to 20 minutes daily is much more effective than a 3-hour marathon once a week. Consistency builds neural pathways that help you process English more automatically.
That's a great point about consistency. Now, let's talk about output, speaking and writing. This is where many learners struggle because it requires more active effort and can feel uncomfortable.
Absolutely. For speaking, I always recommend starting in a low-pressure environment. This could be talking to yourself, recording voice notes in English, or using language exchange apps where you don't need to worry about face-to-face judgment.
And there are so many opportunities for speaking practice now. Language exchange partners via apps like Tandem or HelloTalk, online tutors through platforms like Italki, or conversation clubs both virtual and in person.
For writing, start with short, practical texts like social media posts, emails to friends, or journal entries, then gradually challenge yourself with longer or more formal pieces like opinion essays or professional correspondence.
I'd also recommend the extension technique for both speaking and writing. Take something simple you can already express, then try to extend it with more details, examples, or complex structures. This builds your confidence while stretching your abilities.
Transition sound. Now let's talk about vocabulary and grammar, which provide the building blocks for both understanding and expressing yourself.
This is where a more structured approach often helps. Rather than randomly learning words, focus on high-frequency vocabulary first. The 2,000 most common words in English cover about 80% of everyday conversation.
And once you've mastered those basics, shift to vocabulary that's relevant to your specific goals. If you're learning English for medicine, focus on medical terminology. If it's for business, prioritize business vocabulary.
With grammar, I recommend the notice, understand, practice sequence. First, notice grammatical patterns in your reading and listening. Then understand the rules and logic behind them. Finally, practice using them in your speaking and writing.
That's much more effective than just memorizing rules in isolation. And remember, perfect grammar isn't the goal. Even native speakers make grammatical errors. The goal is to communicate effectively.
Exactly. Now let's talk about strategic practice, the focused work on specific skills that directly relate to your success goals.
This is where your definition of success becomes really important. If your goal is to study at an English-speaking university, you might need to practice note-taking while listening to lectures or writing academic essays under time pressure.
If your goal is business communication, you might practice negotiation vocabulary, presentation skills, or writing persuasive emails. The key is to identify the specific English tasks that represent success for you and practice those directly.
One approach I recommend is task-based learning. Identify a real-world task you want to accomplish in English, then gather the vocabulary, phrases, and cultural knowledge you need to complete it successfully.
That's a great strategy. Now, beyond these 4 core areas, let's talk about some general principles that successful English learners follow.
The first is creating an immersive environment, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country. Change your phone and social media to English, listen to English music, follow English speakers on social media, surround yourself with the language as much as possible.
Another principle is learning in context. Isolated vocabulary lists or grammar rules are much harder to remember than words and structures encountered in meaningful contexts, like stories, conversations, or articles about topics that interest you.
And don't underestimate the power of repetition and review. Research shows that we forget roughly 40% of new information within 24 hours if we don't revisit it. Successful learners build regular review into their study routines.
That's where spaced repetition systems, like Anki, can be helpful for vocabulary. They schedule reviews at optimal intervals to move information from short-term to long-term memory.
Another crucial principle is getting feedback on your English. Without feedback, it's easy to reinforce mistakes or develop a false sense of your abilities.
Yes, feedback is essential. This could come from teachers, tutors, language exchange partners, or even language learning apps. The key is having someone or something that can highlight areas for improvement.
And be specific about the feedback you want. If you're practicing a presentation, ask for feedback on your clarity and pronunciation. If you're writing an email, ask about tone and formality. Targeted feedback is much more useful than general comments. Now let's talk about something that's often overlooked, the psychological aspect of language learning. Success in English isn't just about knowledge and skills, it's also about mindset and habits.
That's so true. Fear of making mistakes is one of the biggest barriers to English success. Many learners stay silent because they're afraid of saying something incorrectly, but this prevents the very practice they need to improve.
I always tell learners to embrace mistakes as learning opportunities. Every error you make and correct is a step toward mastery. Native speakers generally appreciate your efforts to communicate, even if your English isn't perfect.
Another psychological challenge is maintaining motivation over the long term. Language learning is a marathon, not a sprint, and there will inevitably be plateaus where progress seems slow.
One strategy for maintaining motivation is to celebrate small wins, whether that's understanding a joke in English, having a longer conversation than before, or receiving compliments on your writing. Acknowledge your progress, even when it feels incremental.
Combining English learning with your passions and interests also helps with motivation. If you love cooking, follow English language recipe videos. If you're into sports, watch matches with English commentary. This makes learning feel less like work and more like enjoyment.
And don't forget the power of community. Connect with other English learners or join study groups. Sharing challenges and successes with others can provide accountability and encouragement during difficult phases of your learning journey.
That's great advice. Now, as we start to wrap up, let's talk about measuring progress. How can listeners know if they're moving toward their definition of English success?
I recommend maintaining a language learning journal where you regularly assess your abilities. Every few weeks, record yourself speaking about the same topic and compare recordings over time. Note new vocabulary you've learned or new situations where you've used English successfully.
Regular self-assessment is valuable, but so are objective benchmarks. Consider taking standardized tests like IELTS, TOEFL, or Cambridge exams periodically to measure your progress against international standards.
But remember, test scores are just one metric. Real-world performance, like handling a job interview in English or navigating a vacation in an English-speaking country, often provides more meaningful feedback on your success.
Let's summarize the key points for becoming successful in English. First, define what success means to you personally. Second, balance your learning across input, output, vocabulary/grammar, and strategic practice. Third, create an immersive environment and seek regular feedback. And finally, maintain a positive mindset and track your progress.
Those are excellent points. I'd add one final thought. Becoming successful in English is as much about consistency as it is about talent or intelligence. Small, regular efforts compound over time into remarkable results.
Absolutely. And remember that success isn't a destination, but a continuing journey. Even native speakers constantly learn new vocabulary and refine their communication skills throughout their lives.
That brings us to the end of today's episode on how to become successful in English. We hope these strategies help you on your language learning journey. If you have questions or want to share your own success tips, please reach out to us through our website or social media.
Thank you for listening to Artificial Fluency. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe to our podcast and share it with friends who are also learning English. Until next time.
Happy learning, everyone.